March 9th, 1945, 2200 hours, Tokyo Air Defense Headquarters. Lieutenant General Masakazu Kawabe's cigarette trembled slightly between his fingers as the first reports arrived. Through the smoky haze of the underground command center, the veteran commander of Japan's air defenses studied the plotting board with growing disbelief. The markers representing American aircraft weren't showing the usual pattern of a few dozen B-29s approaching at 30,000 feet. Instead, the board displayed wave after wave of bombers coming in at terrifyingly low altitudes, between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, directly toward the heart of Tokyo. "They must be mistaken," Kawabe muttered to his operations officer, Colonel Fumio Sato. "The B-29s never fly this low, and never in such numbers." What the Japanese officer couldn't yet fully comprehend was that he was witnessing the implementation of a radical new American bombing strategy. The B-29 Superfortress, which Japanese pilots had mockingly nicknamed B-san, Mr. B, had been transformed from a troublesome, often ineffective high-altitude precision bomber into something entirely different, a low-altitude nighttime incendiary delivery system of unprecedented destructive capability. As the plotters continued marking incoming aircraft, the mathematics became increasingly grim. Not a dozen bombers, not 50. The radar operators and ground observers were reporting more than 200 massive B-29s approaching Tokyo at 7-minute intervals. Each carried 8 tons of incendiary munitions specifically designed to burn Japan's largely wooden cities to the ground. Lieutenant Yoshi Tanaka, a plotting officer who survived the war, later recalled in his memoirs, "We had been told the Americans had production problems with the B-29, that they had built perhaps 100 of these aircraft total. That night, I watched as our plotting board showed more than 200 of them over Tokyo simultaneously. It was the moment we realized American industrial capacity had been vastly underestimated." The bombers approached from the northwest, using Mount Fuji as a visual reference point in the moonlit night. At precisely 12 minutes past midnight on March 10th, the first Pathfinder aircraft released their loads of napalm-filled M69 incendiary bombs over the densely packed wooden buildings of the Shitamachi district of eastern Tokyo. What followed over the next 2 hours and 40 minutes would transform Tokyo and the Japanese understanding of their vulnerability forever. By dawn, 16 square miles of Tokyo had been reduced to ash. The firestorm had killed more than 85,000 civilians, injured another 40,000, and left over 1 million homeless. In a single night, more people died than in any previous air raid in history, including the atomic bombing of Hiroshima 5 months later. The destruction was so vast that American reconnaissance photos taken the next day showed only a black scar where much of eastern Tokyo had stood. For General Kawabe and the Japanese High Command, the raid represented more than a tactical disaster. It was a terrible revelation about the true scope of American industrial and technological superiority. The B-29 Superfortress, which they had initially dismissed as an overweight, problem-plagued status symbol, had matured into the most devastating strategic bombing platform in history, and America had built hundreds of them, with more arriving every month. The transformation from confidence to despair would unfold over the coming weeks, as B-29s returned night after night to methodically incinerate Japan's major cities. But this night, when 279 B-29s leveled Tokyo in a single raid, marked the beginning of that terrible recognition. 2. The birth of a super bomber. The roots of this industrial mismatch reached back to well before Pearl Harbor. While Japan had been building an air force designed for tactical support of ground and naval operations, America had been developing a revolutionary new concept, the very long-range heavy bomber that could strike enemy homelands from bases thousands of miles away. The B-29 Superfortress emerged from this strategic vision. In January 1940, the United States Army Air Corps issued specifications for an entirely new class of bomber, one that would dwarf any aircraft then in existence. The requirements seemed almost impossible: a top speed of 400 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 40,000 feet, a combat radius of over 1,500 miles while carrying a 4-ton bomb load, and defensive armament operated by remote control. Boeing won the competition with its Model 345 design. Work began immediately, with an unprecedented development budget of $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project that would build the atomic bomb. This single aircraft program consumed more aluminum, steel, and advanced electronics than entire Japanese aircraft industries produced in a year. Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, drove the project with relentless energy, understanding that this weapon system would be crucial for the Pacific War. "The B-29 is more than an airplane," he told his staff in 1942, "is an industrial enterprise. It's America's answer to the vast distances of the Pacific." The development process was troubled. The Wright R-3350 Cyclone engines overheated regularly. The remote-controlled gun system suffered numerous failures. Pressurization systems leaked. Test pilots called it an 11-man coffin. 3 test aircraft crashed, including one that plowed into a Seattle meatpacking plant, killing Boeing's chief test pilot and 20 others. Japanese intelligence, tracking the program through spies and open-source technical journals, reported confidently that the B-29 was a failure. Lieutenant General Torishiro Kawabe, Masakazu's brother, Chief of Staff of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force, dismissed the aircraft in a December 1943 briefing to Emperor Hirohito. "This American super bomber is nothing more than propaganda. If they build it at all, it will be in token numbers only." The Japanese assessment wasn't entirely unreasonable. No nation had ever mass-produced such a complex aircraft. Each B-29 contained 55,000 different parts, 11 miles of wiring, and complex systems never before incorporated into a production aircraft. Building one seemed nearly impossible. Building hundreds seemed fantastical. But America's industrial capacity was transforming fantasy into terrifying reality. While Japanese intelligence estimated that perhaps 20 to 30 B-29s might be built monthly, Boeing had established massive production lines at 4 different plants: in Wichita, Kansas, Renton, Washington, Marietta, Georgia, and Omaha, Nebraska. By late 1944, these plants were producing 100 B-29s every month. By January 1945, a total of 779 had been manufactured, with production accelerating. The mathematics told the story. Japan's entire aircraft industry produced approximately 24,000 aircraft during the entire war. America produced nearly 300,000, including over 3,500 B-29s by war's end. Each B-29 cost more than twice as much as a B-17 Flying Fortress and required twice the crew. Yet America built them faster than they were being lost in combat. This production miracle represented something beyond mere numbers. It demonstrated a fundamental transformation in warfare itself. A nation's industrial capacity had become its most decisive weapon. Third, the strategic vision transforms the journey of the B-29 from controversial project to Tokyo's destroyer wasn't just about industrial production. It required a fundamental shift in bombing doctrine, one that would be as controversial as it was effective. The B-29 was initially designed to conduct high-altitude, daylight precision bombing, similar to what the 8th Air Force was attempting in Europe. The aircraft's pressurized cabin, central fire control system, and high operating altitude were all intended to allow precise strikes on Japanese industrial targets while minimizing vulnerability to fighters and flak. The 20th Air Force began operations against Japan in June 1944, flying from bases in China. The results were deeply disappointing. Brigadier General Haywood Hansell, commanding the XXI Bomber Command from bases in the Mariana Islands, continued the high-altitude precision doctrine through January 1945. After months of operations, the destruction of Japanese industrial targets remained negligible. The B-29s were plagued by problems. The jet stream over Japan, a meteorological phenomenon unknown to American planners, created 200-mile-per-hour winds at bombing altitude, making accurate bombing nearly impossible. Engine fires continued to be common. Mechanical failures forced many aircraft to abort missions. Japanese fighters, though decreasing in number and quality, still managed to shoot down B-29s on almost every mission. Major General Curtis LeMay, who had commanded bomber groups in Europe, arrived in the Marianas in January 1945 to replace Hansell. His assessment was brutally frank. The results had been meager, if not negligible. I was not sent out to the Marianas to make excuses. LeMay's solution would prove to be one of the most controversial decisions of the Pacific War. He completely abandoned the high-altitude precision bombing doctrine that had defined American air strategy. Instead, he ordered his B-29s to strip out most of their defensive armament, load up with incendiary bombs, and attack at night from altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet. The decision horrified many of his staff. Flying heavy bombers at low altitude at night over enemy territory seemed suicidal. Removing defensive guns meant the bombers would be nearly helpless if intercepted. The shift from precision bombing of industrial targets to area bombing of civilian housing districts raised serious moral questions. But LeMay had done the cold mathematics of war. Japanese night fighters were few and poorly equipped. Anti-aircraft guns were calibrated for high-altitude targets. Most importantly, Japanese cities were overwhelmingly constructed of wood and paper, perfect fuel for incendiary bombs. Colonel James Selzer, LeMay's chief of operations, later recalled, "When the general told us his plan, there was dead silence in the room. Then everyone started talking at once. It violated everything we had been taught about strategic bombing. But the general just said, 'We're not here to prove theories. We're here to win a war.'" LeMay himself was blunt about the moral calculus. "We knew we were going to kill a lot of women and children. We knew that Japan was finished if we could burn their cities, kill their productive workers, and destroy their factories. We knew they were finished when we burned up their cities." The first test of this new strategy came on February 25, 1945, when 172 B-29s dropped incendiary bombs on Tokyo from low altitude. While not as devastating as the March raid would be, it proved the concept. 1 square mile of the city was destroyed, with minimal bomber losses. LeMay's decision represented more than a tactical adjustment. It was a complete reimagining of the B-29's purpose. The most expensive, complex bomber ever built, designed for precision bombing from 40,000 feet, would now be used as a massive firebomb delivery system, flying at altitudes within reach of even medium anti-aircraft guns. The gamble would either validate or destroy LeMay's career. As he later wrote, "I knew if it didn't work, I'd be fired and probably court-martialed. But I also knew we had to break the back of Japan, and this was the only way to do it with the tools we had." Before. Operation Meetinghouse unfolds March 9, 1945. 1700 hours. Northfield, Guam. Colonel William Brannock, commanding officer of the 502nd Bomb Group, stood before his assembled crews in the open-air briefing area. Behind him, a large map of Tokyo hung from a wooden frame, certain districts outlined in red grease pencil. The assembled airmen, seated on wooden benches in the tropical heat, fell silent as Brannock began the mission briefing. "Gentlemen, tonight we're going back to Tokyo, but not the way we've gone before." He outlined the mission parameters that would become known as Operation Meetinghouse. Takeoff would begin at 16:30. Aircraft would fly individually, not in formation. Bombing altitude would be between 5,000 and 9,000 feet. Each B-29 would carry mostly E-46 incendiary bombs, bundles of small magnesium incendiaries designed to burn at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to ignite even wet wood. The target is the civilian housing area in eastern Tokyo, Brannock stated bluntly. It's where most of the small manufacturing for the Japanese war effort takes place. Workers' homes double as factories. Our job is to burn it out. The room remained silent as the implications sank in. For months they had been bombing aircraft factories, oil refineries, and military installations from high altitude with questionable results. Now they were being asked to directly target civilians in their homes. First Lieutenant Chester Marshall, a B-29 pilot who survived the war, later wrote in his memoir, "There was no cheering, no excited chatter. We all understood what this meant. We were crossing a line. But we also knew what the Japanese had done in China, in the Philippines, to our POWs. War is hell, and we were bringing hell to Japan." The scale of the operation was unprecedented. 325 B-29s were assigned to the mission, though mechanical problems and aborts would reduce the actual number to 279. Each carried 8 tons of bombs, primarily incendiaries. The total bomb load was 2,000 tons, the largest single bombing raid in history to that point. Weather conditions were ideal, clear skies with a steady surface wind of 28 miles per hour, perfect for spreading fires. Pathfinder crews would mark the target area with napalm bombs, creating distinctive fiery patterns for subsequent aircraft to aim at. The mission was specifically planned to arrive over Tokyo around midnight, when Japanese defenses would be at their lowest readiness. By 2100 hours, all aircraft were airborne, forming a stream of B-29s stretching for hundreds of miles across the Pacific. Each crew knew their precise time over target, creating a choreographed sequence of destruction that would last nearly 3 hours. Captain Robert Simmons, pilot of a B-29 named Black Magic, described the approach to Tokyo. The night was clear, with a nearly full moon. Mount Fuji stood out like a cardboard cutout against the sky. As we approached the coast, we could see searchlights probing the darkness, but they seemed confused, sweeping too high, looking for us where we had always been before, not where we were now. At 14 minutes past midnight, the first Pathfinder aircraft reached the initial point. Major John Grant, the lead bombardier, released his bombs over the densely packed wooden buildings of eastern Tokyo. The distinctive fiery cross pattern bloomed in the darkness below, creating the aiming point for the hundreds of bombers that would follow. Within 30 minutes, a self-sustaining firestorm had developed. The intense heat created powerful updrafts, generating winds on the ground that reached tornado strength, 70 to 80 miles per hour. These winds pulled in oxygen from surrounding areas, feeding the conflagration and spreading it far beyond the initial impact zones. Technical Sergeant Henry Johnson, a tail gunner, described the scene. "I've never seen anything like it. From 8,000 feet, it looked like the entire city was burning. The fires were so bright that I could see to read my watch without turning on a light. The heat was so intense that we could feel it inside our pressurized cabin at altitude. The updrafts created severe turbulence. B-29s were tossed about like toys, sometimes gaining or losing 1,000 feet of altitude in seconds. The smoke and ash rose to over 20,000 feet, forcing later waves of bombers to divert around the worst areas. Japanese defenses were initially disorganized. Anti-aircraft batteries, calibrated for high-altitude targets, struggled to adjust to the low-flying bombers. Night fighters managed to take off from surviving airfields, but lacking airborne radar, they found it nearly impossible to locate the B-29s against the backdrop of the burning city. As the raid progressed, the situation on the ground became apocalyptic. The firestorm's intense heat boiled water in canals. Asphalt streets melted. People trying to escape found themselves stuck in the softened tar. Those who sought refuge in water sources, rivers, canals, ponds, often boiled to death as the water temperature rose. Many suffocated as the fires consumed oxygen. Others were simply incinerated where they stood. Lieutenant Toshiko Kishida, a Japanese air defense officer who survived the raid, wrote in his diary, "It was not just a fire, it was a firestorm, a typhoon of fire. The B-29s kept coming, wave after wave. We had nothing that could stop them. They flew so low, we could see the bomb bay doors open. When I realized how many there were, I knew Tokyo was doomed." The mathematics of destruction were precise and overwhelming. Each B-29 carried 8 tons of bombs. 279 aircraft delivered a total of 2,232 tons of incendiaries. Each E-46 bomb cluster contained 38 individual magnesium incendiaries. Each aircraft carried 37 clusters. In total, the raid dropped more than 390,000 individual firebombs on Tokyo in under 3 hours. By 3:30 in the morning, the last B-29s were leaving the target area. Behind them, Tokyo burned with an intensity visible to crews more than 150 miles out to sea. Of the 279 aircraft that reached the target, only 14 were damaged, and just one was lost to flak. The B-29, once mocked by Japanese pilots as an overweight, problem-plagued failure, had just delivered the most devastating conventional bombing raid in history. March 10, 1945, 7:15 in the morning, the Imperial Palace, Tokyo. Emperor Hirohito stood silently on the roof of the palace library building, his small frame rigid with shock. Through a pair of naval binoculars, he surveyed what had once been eastern Tokyo, where a vibrant city of wooden homes, shops, and small factories had stood 12 hours earlier. There was now only a blackened wasteland stretching to the horizon. Smoke columns rose from still-burning buildings, creating a pall that blotted out the morning sun. "Your Imperial Majesty should not remain exposed," murmured an aide, concerned about both the Emperor's safety and the psychological impact of witnessing such devastation. Hirohito lowered the binoculars but did not move. "I must see what my people have endured," he said quietly. The Emperor's presence on that palace rooftop represented something unprecedented. Japanese leaders had carefully shielded Hirohito from the harsher realities of the war. But the scale of destruction was impossible to conceal. The palace itself, though largely spared due to its stone construction and surrounding moats, had suffered broken windows from the intense heat and pressure waves. The smell of burning permeated even the sacred imperial grounds. What the emperor witnessed that morning would later be documented in the official report prepared by the Tokyo Police Department. 16 square miles completely destroyed, 267,000 buildings burned to the ground, more than 85,000 people dead, most of them civilians. Many victims were so thoroughly cremated that only ashes remained. Entire families had been erased, leaving no one to report them missing. The human toll was beyond comprehension. Bodies floated in rivers and canals where people had jumped to escape the flames, only to boil to death or drown. Children had been separated from parents in the chaos, creating thousands of orphans. Hospitals were overwhelmed, with burn victims lying in rows outside medical facilities that had themselves been damaged or destroyed. The first photographs taken by Japanese authorities were deemed too disturbing to share publicly. They showed entire neighborhoods reduced to fine ash, with only metal objects like cooking pots and bicycles remaining recognizable. Human remains were often indistinguishable from the surrounding debris. The photographs would remain classified until after the war. For Japanese military leaders, the raid represented more than a humanitarian disaster. It was a stark revelation about the nation's vulnerability and America's overwhelming industrial superiority. The B-29 Superfortress, which they had initially dismissed as an overpriced, unreliable white elephant, had matured into the most devastating bombing platform in history, and America had built hundreds of them, with more arriving every month. Admiral Somu Toyoda, Chief of the Naval General Staff, convened an emergency meeting later that day with senior commanders from all service branches. The transcript of that meeting, captured after the war, reveals the first acknowledgement among Japanese leadership of their fundamental miscalculation. "We were told the Americans had perhaps 100 of these B-29 aircraft," said General Yoshijiro Umezu, Chief of the Army General Staff. "Last night, nearly 300 attacked Tokyo alone. Our intelligence suggests they have at least 700 operational, with more being built every day." Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who would later become the father of the kamikaze program, was more blunt. "We are no longer fighting an enemy nation. We are fighting the entire American industrial system. Each B-29 costs more than 10 of our best fighters to build. They are building them faster than we can shoot them down." The mathematics were brutally simple. Japan's entire aircraft industry was producing approximately 1,200 to 1,500 planes per month by early 1945. Many of them obsolete designs built by inexperienced workers with inferior materials. The United States was producing over 8,000 aircraft monthly, including 100 B-29s. Each B-29 required the equivalent of 6,000 man-days to build, nearly 3 times the labor required for a B-17 Flying Fortress. Yet American factories were completing one every 4 hours. Colonel Saburo Shindo, one of Japan's leading fighter aces, had inspected the wreckage of a B-29 shot down over Kyushu in January. His report, presented at the meeting, highlighted the technical sophistication that Japan could no longer match. The aircraft contained more than 1,000 electrical relays, 11 miles of wiring, and alloys we cannot reproduce, Shindo stated. Their remote-controlled gun system alone has more computing power than our entire air defense network. We are not merely behind. We are operating in an entirely different technological era. The raid had also exposed critical weaknesses in Japan's air defenses. Anti-aircraft batteries had fired more than 30,000 shells during the raid, but shot down only one B-29. Japanese night fighters, lacking radar and adequate high-altitude performance, had proven nearly useless against the American bombers. As Lieutenant General Masakazu Kawabe, commander of air defenses, explained, "We prepared to fight them at 30,000 feet, where they had been operating. When they came in at 7,000 feet, our entire defense system was rendered ineffective." The most disturbing revelation came from scientists who visited Ground Zero in eastern Tokyo the next day. The temperatures generated by the firestorm had reached 1,800 degrees Celsius in some areas, hot enough to melt steel and leave imprints of human shadows on concrete walls. This was not conventional warfare, it was a preview of apocalypse. Prince Fumimaro Konoe, former Prime Minister and a close advisor to Emperor Hirohito, later wrote in his diary, "March 10th was the night we realized we were fighting not just the American military, but American science, American industry, and American strategic vision. Against such a combination, conventional resistance is futile." The transformation in perception was complete. The B-29, once mocked by Japanese pilots as B-san, a lumbering, unreliable giant, was now viewed with unprecedented dread. Each distinctive 4-engine silhouette in the sky represented not just a bomber, but a manifestation of American industrial might that Japan had no hope of matching. March 16th, 1945. 2100 hours. Kobe, Japan. The air raid sirens began their mournful wail as 331 B-29s approached Japan's sixth largest city. A week after the Tokyo raid, LeMay's bombers had returned, this time targeting Japan's industrial port cities. Nobuo Takahashi, a 16-year-old member of a civil defense unit in Kobe, later described the psychological impact. When we heard it was the B-29s coming again, people didn't wait for instructions. They simply ran. Some left all their possessions behind. Others committed suicide rather than face the flames. The Americans had created something worse than fear. They had created certainty of destruction. The firebombing campaign continued with mechanical precision. After Tokyo, Nagoya was hit on March 11th with 285 B-29s. Osaka followed on March 13th with 274 bombers. Kobe on March 16th with 331. In 10 days, LeMay's force dropped 13,000 tons of incendiaries on Japan's four largest cities, destroying over 31 square miles of urban area and killing more than 120,000 civilians. For Japanese leadership, the most terrifying aspect was not the current destruction, but the mathematics of what was to come. By April, the number of operational B-29s had grown to over 900. By June, it would exceed 1,200. American factories were delivering new bombers faster than crews could be trained to fly them. The psychological impact on Japan's civilian population was profound. The government had maintained a carefully crafted narrative that Japan remained secure behind its natural oceanic defenses. That narrative collapsed as city after city burned. Civilians who had been told of Japanese air victories and American equipment failures now witnessed the results of America's actual production capability. Ichiro Mikawa, a Tokyo civil servant who survived the March 10th raid, wrote in a letter discovered after the war, "We were told the Americans were soft, undisciplined, unable to match Japanese fighting spirit. Now we understand. They don't need fighting spirit. They have built a machine that destroys cities from the sky, operated by technicians, not warriors. Against such mechanical efficiency, what value has human courage?" This transformation in civilian morale represented more than a psychological defeat. It was a collapse of an entire worldview. The Japanese government had built its war narrative around the concept of Yamato Damashi, the indomitable Japanese spirit that could overcome material disadvantages through willpower and sacrifice. The B-29s demonstrated the limitations of that philosophy against overwhelming industrial capacity. For American military leaders, the firebombing campaign represented a vindication of industrial strategy. General Hap Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces, had pushed the B-29 program through enormous technical challenges and budget overruns precisely because he understood its potential strategic impact. "The B-29 is not merely a bomber," Arnold wrote in an April 1945 assessment. "It is the physical manifestation of American industrial capacity, technical expertise, and strategic vision. It represents our ability to project power across distances our enemies considered insurmountable." The bombers were the visible weapon, but behind them stood America's vast industrial mobilization. By 1945, the United States was producing 4 times as much military equipment as Japan, Germany, and Italy combined. American shipyards had built 74 million tons of shipping during the war. American factories had produced nearly 300,000 aircraft. American refineries were producing 14 million barrels of aviation fuel monthly, more than Japan had access to in an entire year. As spring turned to summer in 1945, the strategic air campaign against Japan intensified. By June, 66 Japanese cities had been targeted. The mathematics of destruction were implacable. 1,680 B-29s would eventually participate in the campaign, dropping 157,000 tons of bombs on Japanese targets. Japanese military leaders understood the implications. General Korechika Anami, the war minister, received a strategic assessment in May that stated bluntly, "America is not winning the war through better tactics or braver soldiers. They are winning through production capacity. They have created an industrial system that produces destruction on a scale we cannot match or counter." Admiral Kantaro Suzuki, who became Prime Minister in April, expressed the situation more poetically. "We are being defeated by American factory workers as surely as by American soldiers. Each bomber that appears over our cities represents hundreds of workers, thousands of machine tools, and millions of dollars in resources that we simply do not possess." The transformation in Japanese strategic thinking between March and August 1945 cannot be overstated. Before the Tokyo firebombing, Japanese leaders still spoke of decisive naval battles, fighting on the homeland beaches, and extracting a prohibitive cost for any American invasion. After witnessing what just 300 B-29s could do in a single night, many privately acknowledged the fundamental mathematical reality: Japan could not win a war of industrial attrition against the United States. June 1st, 1945. Office of War Information, Washington, D.C. A classified strategic bombing survey crossed the desk of Secretary of War Henry Stimson. The document, prepared by the Army Air Forces, contained a statistical assessment that would have been incomprehensible just a year earlier. 67 Japanese cities had been designated for destruction by incendiary bombing. 25 had already been largely destroyed. The remaining 42 were scheduled for destruction by October 1st. The survey estimated that the continuing firebombing campaign would kill between 500,000 and 1 million Japanese civilians and render approximately 20 million homeless. These projections were not guesswork, but mathematical certainties based on demonstrated bombing effectiveness, known Japanese construction patterns, and the accelerating delivery of B-29s to the Pacific Theater. By July, American factories had produced 3,725 B-29s. Many sat idle at airfields across the Marianas because there weren't enough trained crews to fly them all. The United States had achieved production numbers that Japanese military planners had deemed literally impossible. This industrial supremacy transformed the strategic calculation on both sides. For American leadership, the question was no longer whether Japan could be defeated, but how quickly and at what cost. For Japanese leadership, the question had become how to end the war while preserving some semblance of national identity and the imperial system. Emperor Hirohito, who had witnessed the aftermath of the March 10th Tokyo raid firsthand, became increasingly involved in discussions about ending the war. The Imperial Conference on June 22nd included, for the first time, explicit acknowledgement that Japan could not win. According to notes taken by Privy Seal Koichi Kido, the Emperor stated, "We must consider the mathematics of continued resistance. Each night of bombing brings destruction equivalent to a major natural disaster. How long can the nation sustain such losses?" The final calculations were completed in August. 2 atomic bombs, delivered by specially modified B-29s, demonstrated that America could now destroy entire cities with single aircraft. Russia's entry into the Pacific War removed any hope of negotiated peace through Soviet mediation. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. In his surrender broadcast, the emperor spoke of a new and most cruel bomb when referring to the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But for millions of Japanese who had experienced the conventional firebombing campaign, the atomic bombs represented an acceleration of destruction rather than a fundamentally new threat. Their cities were already burning. Their defense systems had already failed. Their industrial capacity had already been overwhelmed. The B-29 had transformed from an object of mockery to the instrument of Japan's defeat. The aircraft that Japanese pilots had once laughingly called B-san had demonstrated the mathematics of modern industrial warfare with devastating clarity. Lieutenant General Masakazu Kawabe, who had watched the plotting board on that fateful March night as hundreds of B-29s approached Tokyo, provided perhaps the most succinct post-war assessment. "We measured victory in terms of courage, fighting spirit, and tactical excellence. The Americans measured it in production capacity, technical innovation, and strategic bombing effectiveness. Their measurement proved more accurate than ours." August 29, 1945, Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur stood on the deck of the USS Missouri as hundreds of B-29s and carrier aircraft flew overhead in a massive display of continued American air power. The surrender ceremony unfolding below represented not just the end of the war, but the validation of an industrial strategy that had fundamentally transformed warfare. The Japanese delegation, led by Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, gazed upward at the aircraft filling the sky. For them, each B-29 represented a technological achievement their nation had dismissed as impossible, then feared as inevitable, and finally accepted as insurmountable. Admiral William Halsey had planned the flyover as a demonstration of overwhelming force, but it served equally as a visual summation of how industrial capacity had decided the war. The aircraft carriers, battleships, and thousands of naval vessels gathered in Tokyo Bay were impressive. But it was the B-29 that had broken Japan's will to continue fighting. The final statistics of the B-29 campaign tell the story with mathematical precision. 3,960 B-29s were built during the war. They flew 33,000 combat sorties against Japan, dropping 169,000 tons of bombs. They destroyed 167 Japanese cities and towns. The aircraft's combat radius of 1,500 miles allowed it to reach targets that Japanese leadership had considered safely beyond the reach of enemy bombers. The financial investment was equally staggering. The B-29 program cost $3 billion, equivalent to $43 billion in today's currency. Each aircraft cost nearly $1 million at a time, when an average American house sold for $3,400. Yet American industry produced them at a rate that Japanese intelligence officers initially refused to believe, then could not comprehend, and finally could not counter. For Japan, the most profound realization was not about the destructive capacity of the B-29 itself, but what it represented: the ability of American industrial democracy to conceptualize, fund, develop, and mass-produce a weapons system of unprecedented complexity and effectiveness. This wasn't merely a technical achievement, it was a philosophical refutation of the militaristic, hierarchical system that Japanese leadership had believed superior to Western democracy. In 1941, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had famously warned his government about American industrial potential. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." By 1945, that warning had materialized in the form of the B-29 Superfortress, the most complex and expensive weapon system ever built, produced in numbers that transformed the strategic equation of the Pacific War. After the war, Japanese military officers were extensively interviewed by American strategic bombing survey teams. Their testimony revealed how completely their perception had transformed from mockery to dread. General Saburo Endo, who had headed bomber development for the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force, stated, "When we first heard about the B-29, we laughed. An aircraft that size, with that range, at that cost. Impossible. When we saw the first few over Tokyo, we were concerned but still confident. When we saw 300 in a single night, we knew the war was lost, not because of that raid alone, but because of what it represented. America's ability to build the impossible, not once, but hundreds of times." The story of the B-29 is more than a tale of technological triumph. It represents the moment when industrial capacity became the determining factor in modern warfare. The Japanese pilots who had laughed at early reports of an American superbomber discovered too late that in an age of total war, production statistics matter more than individual heroism. Engineering capacity more than fighting spirit, and industrial mobilization more than tactical brilliance. The transformation from mockery to dread occurred in a single night, March 9th to 10th, 1945, when 279 B-29s leveled Tokyo in history's deadliest conventional air raid. In those terrible hours, as 16 square miles of Japan's capital burned with unprecedented fury, the mathematics of modern warfare were written in flame against the night sky. Japan had lost not just a battle or a campaign, but an industrial contest it had never truly understood. The B-29 Superfortress remains, 78 years later, the definitive symbol of how industrial might translates into military power. The aircraft that Japanese pilots had mockingly nicknamed Bisan became the weapon that ended the Pacific War and demonstrated that in the age of industrial warfare, productive capacity is the ultimate strategic resource. In the words of Major General Curtis LeMay, who orchestrated the firebombing campaign, the Japanese fought with great courage and tactical skill. But you cannot fight factories with bayonets. You cannot shoot down assembly lines. The B-29 wasn't just a bomber, it was American industrial might made manifest. And against that, courage alone is not enough.